certain things, and I feel like if you educate on those things, that's your strength. So that would be my sharing story with that. Because yeah, we share the same thing. People in Oahu say, Oahu's gone, like no more fish already.
Right.
But you know what? There's certain places where you can still, like if you know.
And we've all seen instances, not just Oahu, but across the Hawaiian Islands, across the Pacific, where our islands are really resilient, and all they need sometimes is a year or two of just no perturbations and just really good natural resource management, and you actually see the system not come back to complete recovery, but at least some sort of rehabilitation, right? So it's just, we're gonna have to think really hard and long about how we can coexist with our resources, right? Because at the end of the day, it's really good to conserve, but at the same time, right, these are resources that we depend on. And at the end of the day, we're gonna use them. But we also have to rehabilitate what we take, so.
A couple things about education and management. I have both biology and law degrees, but years ago I managed a project. A big part of it was trying to help fisheries come back through education. And one of the things we discovered was educating 12 and 13-year-olds had the biggest impact. By the time they get into 14 and up, they are now as set in their ways as adults are, but they're impressionable prior to that. The other thing, of course, as some of you probably already know, and you just mentioned, well, you have to give the resources a break. But there's so many case studies where they did give the resources a break. And one of them is down around the reef down where the aquarium is. And the minute they're opened up again, they're fished down to zero.
Exactly.
So it's an argument for having marine protected areas that are permanent, so at least you have a breeding stock that isn't touched ever.
So my question to everyone here is how do we solve the real issue? I mean, putting a Band-Aid on the bleeding wound, it's gonna slow the bleeding, but it's not gonna coagulate completely. So, my burning question is how do we even get this off the ground? Because it all sounds good in concept, but to take that abstract idea and sort of put it into fruition, that would be my team to you legal experts, is how can we really conceptualize this?
So I can talk a little about that. Ian and I in law school were in this class. It was a practical class. We worked on a project, the Kokolego Marine Reserve project, and they implemented, or they had DAR, they went and worked with DAR, and DAR implemented a rest period of 10 years to replenish the fish stocks in that area. But they were also aware that when it opens back up, everyone's just going to go straight back in. So what they're trying to do in the meantime is run educational programs and find out how they can teach the youth the sustainable practices so that when it opens up, people already have the mindset that's necessary to keep the resource self-replenishing.
And in addition to doing an educational outreach during this 10-year period, they're also trying to work on getting regulations specific to their area. And so this 10-year period is really great because they have all this time to get this education and to work on these regulations and to give the resource time to recover. So it's not something that was easy for them to implement, but I think it's a really great case study for a project like this. Even though it's not a permanent closure, it's next best thing, I think. And
maybe along those same lines, basically trying out new management alternatives. Here, what I consider a huge success study has been Kahekili. They want to do something about it in Maui, in a small area in Maui. And obviously, every time you try to do, that for the fish and the coral, probably the best, from a biological perspective, the best thing you can do is to do an outtake area. But it's unworkable. In most cases, the community will not be up for that. So they set a herbivore replenishment area. You can fish for anything that is not a herbivore. So you can fish for your predators and all that, but the herbivores are there, should be there. And the reason for that, the rationale, was to allow for the coral reef to recover. And the linkage between the herbivore and the reef is a lot stronger than other types of fish and the reef. So basically it became a coral reef area that you're managing through the herbivore. 10 years later, the community was that was a lot easier peel to take for the community. And 10 years later, the herbivory mass has increased, in some cases double or triple, depending on the species. We experience tremendous amount of coral bleaching. The good news is that the coral cover there has stabilized. We'd like to see it grow, but at least stopped it from declining. And the CCA, the cross-coralline algae, has tripled in that amount of time. So it's a new management alternative. We're not getting it's a good compromise between status quo and an outtake area. So that's potentially something that could be tried out.
And I think one of the things in Guam we try to do is, our reefs we have one lagoon, everything else is relatively exposed, and most of the reef is, 90% of it is basically fringing reef. So our reefs are actually more suitable for a pelagic fishery. And some of the things we can do to offset some of the coastal harvesting is you can actually exploit the pelagic fishery, in times when there's like high sedimentation or high rain frequencies or high rain intensities. So, in the 10-year study you guys brought up, we've been seeing that. I've been seeing that time and time again. Where you give a coral reef 10 years to recover, and then you let humans back in, basically goes to depletion. There's even been studies where they actually look at proximity to inhabited islands and see how the abundances of resources actually diminishes the closer you get to like an established sort of westernized nation, So there's definitely a lot of data out there, but it seems what I'm gathering, especially from the work you guys are doing with Doe Care, is these little micro programs that you kind of give the community and say, here, this is yours, and what you do with it is what you're going to get out of it. It seems like that's really working, because we're coming in with the sort of like the cloud, right? And like, oh, you guys should do this, we're going to save all the fish, but in reality, we kind of have to build certain species up before we can start thinking about other things. So maybe the micro management of having these communities, small communities, take ownership of parcels of submerged lands or coastal lands actually goes a long way in trying to solve the entire Oahu problem. Have that blanket rule that says, okay, native Chamorros or native inhabitants of Guam are now going to have certain rights in terms of resources, and then sort of regulate what those rights are by putting specific regulations in. But my question is, and you've probably seen this looking at multiple case studies across multiple Pacific Island nations, is how do you take an island like Guam, that has a track record of like traditional Spanish fishing methods, right? And then you also have the Japanese occupation, right? So you can also claim there was some sort of whatever the fishing method they were doing essentially was traditional, right? Then you have, some of these European nations that were coming through and visiting, so obviously whatever they left their mark on can still be claimed as traditional. So it goes back to like, how do we even define a timeline to even start putting legislation so we can start putting regulations to sort of meet those goals? I know it's like we're dreaming big right now, right? But that, like, if we're trying to solve our issues, these are the issues we have to tackle.
Yeah, those are great questions, and I think it's more of a policy decision to determine what types of fishing practices the people of Guam want to promote or prohibit, and I think it all comes down to what is sustainable, because that's a big factor in our development of CBSFAs. It's like, okay, this may have been a traditional practice, but is it sustainable? And so you look at
this point in time, right?
Right,
At this
right.
point in time,
Considering
it's
the
sustainable.
decline
It may have been
fishery.
sustainable back when the fishery was
Right.
booming, but
Right.
so I see.
Yeah.
Yes.
Plus, if you're looking at a Japanese tradition or a Spanish tradition, those traditions evolved not in tropical
Right.
ecosystems.
Right.
They are temperate water systems, and they may have worked
Right,
in temperate water systems, but they just flat out don't
Yeah.
work in the context.
And it's good thing you bring that up, because the methods we're talking about, we see that actively to this day. Like surround net fishing. People will go on, we call it tensulu. You go in there, surround an area with a net, and then just basically spear everything within the net, right? We also do cast netting, right, from shore. So there's a lot of practices that sort of carried over into modern culture, which goes back to, these guys can always argue this is a traditional method because it was implemented prior to colonization, and we're still carrying it over into our modern day practices.
Yeah.
So, but like you said, right, we have to identify sustainable practices.
And Hawaii may be unique because traditional Hawaiian rights are built into our constitution.
Yes, there was agreements set in place prior
Yeah.
to becoming a colony.
And so actually, a lot of our Native Hawaiian rights have kind of been established through case law,
Right.
or at least the method of validating if a Native Hawaiian practice is legitimate. And it's not really outlined in any statute, but it's actually like courts looking on a case-by-case basis at the actual practice, that if it wasn't Native Hawaiian, it'd be a violation of state law. But they look at different factors, and the courts have outlined these factors. Was this practice handed down from your family? Did they traditionally practice in this area, or if they're not from this area, did they have permission to practice in this area? Is it for subsistence purposes or commercial purposes? So all these factors that the court looks at has been kind of developed through case law. So it's pretty well established on the terrestrial side. There's almost no case law on the marine side, and so it still has to be played out. There's some
There's
things that
maritime
maybe
law also in
translate.
addition to the marine environment, right? So you have
Yeah.
maritime law and then a whole bunch of other
not so
stuff.
much maritime. That's more like
Open water stuff.
high seas, yeah. But it is different because on land, a lot of these cases involve trespassing over private property,
Oh, I see.
whereas the oceans here are public.
Yeah.
And so it's slightly different, but you can use some of those principles from these previous terrestrial cases and kind of forecast how a court might rule on the marine side.
Okay.
Okay, he just does it himself. Voting enforcement.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever tried deputizing community members?
Just
Were you
talking about
Is that what you're talking
that.
about? I was wondering about it earlier. I know American Samoa, for their community-based fisheries management program, deputizes the local village mayor. And so that person kind of has some authority. I don't know if they can physically arrest someone. I think they had some issues with that, but they can stop someone, bring them to shore, and I think they have the ability to confiscate what they get. So they can, instead of sending it, instead of writing a ticket, they can just say oh, you caught this in our waters, so we're going to use it to feed the local community on Sunday instead.
Hurrah! That is
I think.
I think they still have to involve DNWR.
I think they still have to call,
Yeah.
yeah. But there's kind of there's somebody in these small communities who can.
You know what, we
Yeah,
do
be the
have,
voice.
yeah, so as opposed to being a full-fledged officer, we do have our volunteer program where they're not paid, but they're considered VOs. That's probably the closest thing in regards to that.
But we haven't had that program in so long. We
Yeah.
haven't run it because we didn't have an academy. So now that we have academy, maybe we can start it back up. But we have 2 volunteer officers. I know at least.
Yeah, we have 3 senior volunteer officers that's been with us for a long time now. But back in the mid 1900s, we actually had more volunteer officers than full-fledged officers in the state of Hawaii. Actually, at that time, it was the territory of Hawaii, but we actually had more, where we had 8 full-time wardens at that time, and I like to say almost 100 volunteer officers.
So these are
It's
just
impressive.
community members that cared about their resources.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
wanted to.
Yeah, and the good thing about being a warden, of course, is you're pretty much patrolling the area that you live at because of the very reason: quicker response time, your innate knowledge of that area, resources, your community contacts, and of course your rapport with everybody over there, including your suspects and of course your key community members.
I think in American Samoa, the villages, it's hard to enforce within the villages, so they're really good about enforcing on the people that come in the village. But when it
Maybe
comes
not.
to, within the village, it gets a lot more difficult.
So Dover harbor agents used to have authority to issue citations, but it got to the point where there was favoritism and bias, and so that authority got taken away. But it's that same thing with the small island community. When everybody knows each other, it's hard.
Yeah.
And going back to the volunteer officers, they actually are really helpful on a lot. I don't want to say half, but a lot of our fishing and resource violations come from them.
They're bringing a lot.
Yeah, and because it's easier for them to go out at night when most of the poaching happens, because they don't need to call in and request a special assignment or overtime. They can just go, and Phil lives on the hill right above Wailupe Beach Park, so he sees lights in the water and he puts a call out. So that's how we got that one lanetter that I was talking about, the serial poacher.
So your volunteer statute or authority doesn't require like an officer to be with the volunteer?
So they are
officers.
officers.
They're
so
officers.
It's not just a community member, they're an
not.
actual
They-
officer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're actual officers, but we haven't included anybody new as of yet. And hopefully this academy can be an avenue to take care of that issue also.
Yeah, so we have a similar statute, but and again, we don't have rules, 'cause we're missing all the rules. But we have a similar statute, and it gives them all the powers and authority while they are accompanying an officer. So your statute does away with that. The volunteer officers just are officers.
Yes, they're just not paid, they're not union members and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
But they have to do the full training of an officer?
Yeah, full training. A lot of them have their reasons why. Maybe their values run along our mission statement, protecting other resources. But they've been, like what Ian mentioned, they've been super efficient and I mean their enforcement pretty much compares to our full-time officers, just because they have the flexibility. Where with our full-time officers, we gotta consider your union rights, and they may get paid more than usual. That doesn't impact the budget, so that's all this stuff we got to consider.
I'm not sure exactly, but there is a minimum amount of hours volunteers
Yes.
are.
I'm not too sure too,
like
but
8 hours a week or something.
I'm not too sure. I can get that
Something like
data.
that.
Yeah.
So it's not like they're just really passive officers. They are on the job essentially.
And on top of that,
maintain their status.
they do a lot of not just enforcement because of their flexibility. They do a lot of outreach. They're very, very, very flexible with the outreach. They love the outreach. A lot of our VOs at this, they're older, so the enforcement, kind of came and went, but there's still an asset in regards to the outreach and education, and that kind of frees up our, full-time officers to do the enforcement side.
As far as deputizing, like Makai has always said, like we don't deputize people, but this academy was a way of saying, like, we've listened to you, we've heard you, and this is a way that community level people can become enforcement officers and become not deputized but actual law enforcement officers, federal care. So it's kind of a way where we kind of deputize them in the community, but if you pass everything, you can become an officer. So we made an avenue for that.
And I think it's a really important avenue because we had an incidence of essentially vigilantism, where community members go out and full-on citizens arrest people and don't really follow any sort of protocol, and it's been an issue. So I think having this avenue for people to go out and become actual officers, and to put more officers out there to avoid the perceived necessity of these kinds of actions is really important.
And a big part.
We have fatigue. Which is okay, maybe we're satiated.
Well, for the other jurisdictions, one question I had: have you explored opportunities for funding a legal fellow position? Like, you know, we funded ours through the CRCP, but you know, there's other creative funding sources that we've tapped into, and just wondering, like, if you've looked into the possibilities.
Yeah, so I know NOAA OCM through our CZ program funded a legal fellow position for us. Not a legal fellowship, a legal internship. So it was like a 5-month project. I think, I was just telling Paolo that the 309 program under OCM, you know, addressing, because those things are supposed to lead specifically to program changes. And so you could use your 309, especially under cumulative and secondary impacts, as a funding source, because everybody will be writing their 2021 to 2024 309 program starting this October to be approved for next year, that sort of thing. And then we can always mobilize those people. OIA for at least 4 of us, different office.
And then are there law school partnerships that you could tap into?
So over on our side of the world, like I think Nova might have an environmental
We'll
lab.
look to Florida.
Yeah.
But nothing local.
Like, I know University of Miami has a law school, but whether or not they have, like, let's say an environmental law certificate or something like that, that type of program, I don't believe it happens. Our local university actually does a lot with Yale's School of Environment and their JD program. What's his name? Benoit? Dr. Benoit? Yeah, so, like, there's something that exists, but it's not necessarily marine law, it's more just on the conservation side.
Where would you house this person?
Well, luckily for me, CZ and Coral are all under my one office, so.
Because we're split between CZ and Coral, and neither one is in the because I'm not the regulatory agency.
Right.
So I think we would struggle to put a legal fellow in our regulatory agency and have that be successful. So I think if we could place them either in my office, the Bureau of Citizen Plans, and have them work with the regulatory agency, or even at the AG's office.
Is there like a Department of Natural Resources?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
So they're under that umbrella. But this would be like, Edwin might have access to those funds, and so long as it would bring across a program change, at least under 309.
Yeah, but then CZ doesn't do fisheries, so that's under Department of Agriculture, which would be really hard to put somewhere there. And I think it would be, for a fellow, it would be really beneficial if they were from Guam, particularly if they were working on fisheries issues.
Even if they were a fisherman from Guam.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Well, just in terms of the connections with law schools, I mean, we're certainly, through our different networks, willing to reach out to other programs that might be of interest, whether it's domestic or international. I mean, like Stetson, they're on the wrong side of the peninsula, but they do a lot of work. And so, I mean, we're happy to help explore and talk with them about how well it works here, and whether they encourage them to.
I think it was Christine that just said that same thing. We were talking about it, and it's kind of like being an underwater archaeologist. There's only a handful, so you guys' network can probably most likely be pretty tight, and being able to reach out to another program that has similar interests and capacities and such. I mean, that would be good.
Yeah, and Steve and Myrie have a legal counsel appointed by the AG that sits at our office. So they handle most of our litigation and everything.
And he's stretched pretty thin a lot of the
is.
time, but we also have the benefit, just like USDI, of having those 309 options to fund that. So,
but I'm not sure, they're not always environmental law students. Our last one was an environmental law.
No.
Yeah, so it depends what we get or who gets hired.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in looking at several of the things, I've always had this viewpoint that the less we can actually make into a case of some sort, but rather handle administratively, the better, the more efficient, because you know, once something gets into a court system or something like that, it just takes a whole lot longer to process out. And like I've seen what happens, especially in the Park Service, in the USVI, where if something has to go up to their Solicitor General's office, then that also takes a very long time. And, you know, something is being heard 3 or 4 years down the line. Well, that we're talking about natural resource impacts, and so those we want to address as quickly as possible, especially we want to have the mitigation done as quickly as possible. So, you know, being explicit in terms of what your penalty schedule is and the level of infraction, I think is a good idea. Because, you know, I said it next door, like if somebody has an undersized fish, somebody has an undersized fish. You don't walk away from that. If somebody has gear that's illegal, that gear is illegal. You can't walk away from that. But to build in those things where your serial offender can't just continue to pay a fine and do something. So there has to be some, like he can graduate to some level of consequence that then costs that individual.
Time to